So our first speaker is Beate Kubitz, who will be talking about decarbonizing rural transport using flexible on-demand buses. Beate is a transport consultant with extensive experience in future mobility and the role it played in reducing the carbon emission and through innovation research and policy development. Okay, so the talk will be excellent, I believe. Okay, that's mainly because in 10 years ago, so when I tried to took a bus in Princeton during the visit in the United States, I don't have any driving license. I had to wait for the bus. Okay, so that bus interval is worth about 1 hour per bus. Okay, so I just missed one bus. That means I have to wait for 1 hour in the cold day. So that gives me some opinion about how to design a bus system. So maybe you should have like on-demand bus system. So the bus should be responsible to the request or something like that. Okay, so now welcome Beate to give a presentation on this.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me just see if I can share my screen. Where's it gone? There we go. Right, the amazing, oh, why is this right at the beginning? Apologies, we're going to see it all backwards and then see it forwards in a moment. Right, okay, so my name is Beate Kubitz and I'm a transport consultant, and recently I've been doing some work on rural transport and peri-urban transport and flexible on-demand buses. And this work has kindly been funded by the Foundation for Integrated Transport and with a contribution from Pedam Mobility, both financing and access to case studies and data. So one of the biggest problems I've found is that we have we blur the edges between rural and urban very much in the UK. We tend to talk about greater urban areas and forget that actually a greater urban area is quite often very lumpy in terms of its population. The World Bank sees cities as 50,000 people, and this definition of at least 1,500 inhabitants per kilometre square is quite interesting to me, because when I started to look at areas in Greater Manchester, which is sort of near to me, I was looking at the city and thinking, yeah, technically it's over 2,000 people per kilometre square. But once you get down to even just a slightly more granular level, you can see that actually 10 boroughs, and those 10 boroughs are very, very different in their population characteristics. You have the city of Manchester, which is extremely dense, and 98% of its people live in an urban density kind of density as defined by the World Bank. But just north of it, Oldham, it's not even 1,500 people per square kilometre. So you've got variations between boroughs that are quite different, and call into question this definition of urban. And then you also have the land mass. What's quite interesting to me is that in Bolton, which I've become completely fixated by, you have 86% of the population living at this 1,500 people per kilometre square density, but only in 56% of the borough, which means that you've got lots of space that is populated much less densely, and the lowest density in Bolton is at 200 people per kilometre square. So you've got this really kind of patchy area. Just check that I've got it right. Okay, apologies. I thought there was a different slide next. So and that patchiness also maps to the transport map of Manchester. Manchester has a scoring system called the GMAL, the Greater Manchester Accessibility Level Score, and this map here shows you those dark areas are the most accessible areas according to this scoring system, and the lighter areas are the least accessible. And as you can see, the centre of Manchester, where the densest population is, also has the best transport, and further out into the boroughs it's much less dense, and it's questionable about whether those dark areas actually are well enough connected to the lighter ones. And then obviously you've got this mapping of transport or this inverse relationship between public transport and car driving, where the thing that I found very interesting is where cars are coming from, because central Manchester has a lot of has both a lot of transport and a lot of cars. And when you look at where those drivers are coming from, they're actually not coming from within central Manchester. The people who are driving into central Manchester are coming from those poorly served by public transport boroughs around the perimeter of Manchester and much further beyond. And what's really interesting about this is that all those lighter shaded blue areas, despite the fact they are considerably lighter, they represent over around 75% of the traffic converging on central Manchester. So car travel into central Manchester, 75% of it is coming from outside central Manchester, 48% of it is coming from the other boroughs, and 27% is coming from much further afield. So you've got this strange kind of convergence on central Manchester of hordes of cars. People within central Manchester tend to travel by car much less, and so they're kind of beholden to these people arriving in vehicles. Oh, sorry, I'm still not dealing with this. And obviously, this maps to carbon. We can see in the excellent carbon dot place tool that, that the team at Decarbonate have produced, that carbon production comes from the outer boroughs and outside central Manchester per capita, much more than it does in the centre. So everything maps very closely. To work out how to do this better. So back to Bolton. Bolton has got 276,000 residents, and it's generally just under 2,000 people per kilometre square, but it's very divergent. And that means that if you go into the sort of edges of Bolton, you can travel quite a long way to reach your destination. It's a very kind of lumpy population distribution and a lumpy set of destinations. When this really excellent data shine tool shows you where people leaving are travelling to from my chosen area of Horwich and Bolton. And that map shows that people are mainly travelling into the centre of Bolton, but then you've got a much more dispersed travel pattern around into central Manchester and greater Manchester, and sometimes to the north. So one of the things I wanted to do is find out that, given that a lot of these people are travelling by car, what's it like to travel from Horwich? So I interviewed some people, and the stories that they told me were pretty depressing from a transport perspective. A commuter who works in central Manchester, she gets the first train every morning just to beat the parking queues, and so that she can get home early, because the earlier trains are more reliable than the later trains when she's coming on her way home. But if she wants to avoid driving, she's faced with a reasonably long walk and a bus or a train, and the penalty to that means that in each direction, you're looking at 30 minutes in each direction, and it just makes her journey too long for her to comprehend doing it by public transport. She'd love to cycle, but she thinks it's unsafe. Similarly, if you're travelling to work in the centre of Bolton, you're looking at a 9 to 10 mile journey, which is quite a long journey. And in a car, it's under 30 minutes. But on a bus, it's it's around about an hour. It requires a change. People get nervous about changes, and it can be quite, the journey times can be quite variable. Now, I interviewed a brave soul who occasionally cycles to work from Horwich, and if you read his account of what it's like, he drives most frequently because it's quite a long way, but he would happily cycle a couple of times a week, apart from the fact that his interview was like, and here's another death-defying feat that I have just achieved in order to get another mile along the road. It involves articulated lorries, motorway junctions, 3-lane roundabouts, and 4-lane dual carriageways. And none of these are suitable really for cycling, and it takes someone with extreme, possibly even a death wish, to want to do that kind of a thing. So the end result of all of this is that lots of people own lots of cars, and cars are a problem. They're not even though they mainly sit still, but they mainly sit still, embedding a lot of carbon, 6 to 35 tonnes per vehicle. People use them more than they intend to because they've sunk their costs into them, so they don't use other modes of transport, or as few as possible. They take up loads of road space, loads of car parking space that could be better put to use for other social and economic uses. So generally car ownership is not very great for the environment, for decarbonising. The obvious solution, we all know, make car ownership more expensive, make it less convenient, and make the alternative safe, attractive, and provide lots of public and shared transport solutions. But this latter we've found has been really quite tricky over the years, because we've had a privatised bus service which has sort of like devolved to or left the routes to being main routes along corridors, and the networking of bus services has become problematic. And also the connections between bus and rail, as I found in my interviews, have been not sufficient, and the many-to-many kind of journeys that people tend to do by their cars are not really, they're not efficiently covered. So the role of DRT, in my view, is both to provide an on-demand service, the kind of service that Hong was talking about, that where you've got where you know, missing a bus doesn't know, you know, if you book your bus ahead, you're not going to miss it. It provides services across areas rather than just down main corridors, and we're looking at kind of buses and that are not necessarily just powered by apps. People can phone to catch buses, or book well in advance through service providers. And the idea, I think, is that DRT provides an alternative to car ownership. We published a survey last, I think it was in May, of people's views of DRT, and this came through that we really need something to give people an alternative to private car ownership. Because at the moment, given the kinds of journeys that people are making, there isn't really a viable solution for them. The time penalties and the unreliability is too great for people to want to rely on the current bus system. You've got other benefits. You can electrify more easily, and you can maximise the amount of time a vehicle's being used. I think one of the big wastes of our society is the lightly used cars, which have had huge amounts of carbon put into them in their production. Whereas if you're making one vehicle that's being used for lots of trips, you're creating carbon benefits. So this is the case study that, well, there are 3 case studies that I've looked at in terms of how DRT is being used in France, because in France there's a law which impels local authorities to provide public transport for their populace, wherever their populace is. And so the area of Le Cotentin in France, which is around Cherbourg and on the Atlantic coast, is an area that hasn't previously been served by public transport, and an on-demand bus was installed to cover these 3 villages and link the villages to Le Cotentin, to Cherbourg. And they designed the service so that it had pick-up and drop-off points. It wasn't completely door-to-door, but the drop-off points were within a kilometre, so around about half a mile at most from any of the from the population. And they both augmented a low-frequency bus service on the coastline, and also added services that hadn't previously existed. And they connected them to rapid transit routes, which I think we have to remember there tend to be more rapid transit routes in France. So this model maybe works better where you've got a railway already, if you're looking to the UK. So it was a trial service. It was only a very small service to start off with. The most interesting user group that emerged from running this service was the replacement for the parent taxi, which actually is an enormously carbon saving replacement, because when you consider dropping the kids at Scouts tends to mean 4 different trips. The drop the child off, go home, collect the child later. So you're looking at quite an inefficient use of the car. Whereas suddenly if you're a child is able to catch a bus independently, that you're pretty sure they'll actually get there, there's no changes, it's a shared service with other young people, then you have suddenly eliminated some of those trips and reduced the carbon footprint quite considerably. So this is a French example, and I think the thing we need to remember about France is that they the transport services are a human right in France, and services are expected to be well subsidised. Then again, the other use of DRT in France that we've seen is in Paris. Paris, although it's much bigger, is similar to Manchester in some ways, because it has an extremely well-served centre where the mayor is absolutely going great guns on deep greening it, decarbonising it, putting in bike lanes, banning cars. And then you have the Ile-de-France, which is far more diffuse and full of people who really hate the mayor in the centre of Paris because she won't let them drive their cars into the centre of Paris. So the way that they're trying to change the transport system around the centre of Paris is to install demand responsive transport, connecting people to the main routes into Paris so that they don't need to have this sort of constant war on trying to slip through the peripherique in their vehicles, it's an interesting model, and it's one that seems to be increasing in take-up. The third example that we have is down in the Pays de Loire, near Nantes, where the demand responsive transport links towns and villages to the centre. I'm really not sure why this thing is not very good at going next. Okay. So where the links happen, you have a nice little you have small tiny villages which are connected to the main rail line into Nantes. The average trip, when I looked at the data behind this for the demand responsive for people using demand responsive transport, was around 12 kilometres. People were being linked mainly to the station from roundabout, from the little villages round about the mainline stations. And this was pretty interesting as well, because all of these schemes have a very similar kind of model, that the authorities are prepared to subsidise them to around about 20 euros per trip. And then as the software enables the better sharing of transport, it becomes more relied upon, and people tend to use it more, and you get efficiencies of scale. They managed to bring the amount per trip that it's subsidised down to a whole €8. I can see some transport planners blanching in the background here, and then the authorities are prepared to consider putting a fixed line in. So it's kind of using DRT in some ways to stimulate demand, help people to get out of their cars, and then provide even more comprehensive services in future. So yes, it's a different context, but it has encouraged people to use it. It's created different groups of bus users within France, the young people who were being ferried around by their parents, people who were driving to the stations, and it creates journey times that are acceptable. I think this is one of the issues that I've really found when I've been looking at Bolton, is that some of the journey times that we really want people to change to bus and rail and to adopt low carbon transport, but the journey times, because of the models of transport that we've been using, the corridor bus network, they just become unsustainable, partly because of stops, partly because of changes, partly because of friction. A lot of it is to do with congestion, so we need to look at whether, if we're going to keep people allow and encourage people to use buses, we need to look at bus infrastructure, or thinking about buses more as connectors to mainline rail. I'm going backwards again, I do apologise. I've got a mouse issue going on, and not the real rodent type. So one of the things that I have sort of been really concerned about is, once you look at the maps, we have all these dots and they look great, but what's actually useful? And giving something an assignment of 1 to 8 seems to mean that we think we've done the job. But actually, when we look at maps, having a map there doesn't necessarily reflect on people's experience. And at the moment, if you've got 40 stops on a bus line, or routes that really don't match up with people's needs and desires, and just because you can give it a score doesn't actually mean that it's good enough to replace car travel. So the point that I think that I want to make is that we need to really throw the book at this. We encourage, well, car travel has become the behaviour change that has been allowed over the last 70 years. We've had 70 years to go from a low car society to a car dependent society. We've got about 10 to reverse that. So we absolutely need to look at the really radical things, providing lots of different solutions, thinking that we are actually going to have to spend money on bus connection and different models of demand responsive transport, and not being shy of thinking this is something that we have to put a lot of resources into, because the alternative is so potentially dangerous and will create much more. Climate change will create a much greater disaster than worrying too much about how much a DRT is going to cost. I think that in summary, because demand responsive transport, it gives you an experience that will compete with car travel, that people can be confident in it, that it has fewer stops and connections. It's a tool that we can use to change behaviour. It will reduce carbon. It won't reduce carbon to zero, nothing will, but it has the potential to do that, particularly if you can be smart and optimise your trips. It's not cheap, but there are potential economies of scale, potential ways of increasing passenger numbers, and it's a good way of managing resources. So that's my kind of rundown on the potential for demand responsive transport for the day. Thank you very much to the people who have borne with me over what seems like a lot of slides. Apologies for that. And please do ask if you have any questions. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Very good timing. Thank you. So our second speaker is Dr. Craig Morton, so from Loughborough University, who will be talking about the temporal demand for e-scooters, preliminary results from examination of trials in 4 US cities. So Craig is a lecturer in the School of Architecture, Building and Civil Engineering in Loughborough University. He had previously been employed as research fellow in Aberdeen, Trinity College Dublin, and also University of Leeds. Okay, so now welcome Craig to give a presentation.
Thanks very much for the introduction. Hong, can you see my slides? Okay, if you give me a thumbs up, that would be great.
Yeah, excellent.
Champion. First I'd like to begin by just offering my gratitude to Hong and the rest of the Decarbonate team for putting on this conference. I've been in a few sessions on Monday and Tuesday, and I was pleasantly surprised and stimulated by the conversations that were going on. Putting on these virtual conferences is difficult, and I think this one's really showed how it should be done. So as Hong said, my name is Craig Morton, currently a lecturer at Loughborough University. Been here 4 years now, time flies, since I was back at ITS. The title of my presentation today, the temporal demand pattern for e-scooters, definitely preliminary results from the examination of trials in 4 US cities. First things, what I've got to do is I've got to modify this title. I'm going to have to say I didn't do 4 cities. I only did 3 cities, so sorry about that. In classic academic style, what I've done here is I've overpromised to get my foot in the door for the conference, and I'm going to underdeliver in the presentation, so my apologies from the outset. A little bit of scene setting to crack off. I imagine most people in the room are aware of this, but I'll just do it anyway. When I was a younger man, micromobility was primarily just bicycles, human-powered bicycles. There was probably a little bit of, skateboarding, maybe some roller skates as well, but it was mostly human-powered cycles. Over the last 5 years, we've seen quite a wide diversification in this subsector of the transport market. And this has been mostly motivated by technological advancements, the downscaling of very small but energy rich and energy dense battery packs, linking them to electric motors, has allowed for quite a rich set of new platforms of electrically powered small vehicles to emerge. Perhaps most visible in the e-scooters, I would say, perhaps more visible there. And those e-scooters started to show up in the US market about 4 years ago very prominently. Initially, the vendors who came up with that business model just went along to cities and dumped a load of e-scooters on the street without the permission of the municipalities. The municipalities weren't really happy about that, as you can expect, and so they quickly tried to regain control by introducing trials for these schemes, which have gone on for about 3 seasons now, 3 summers. In terms of the UK, we were a bit more cautious in the UK. E-scooters were initially unlawful to use on our streets. They still are. You can only really use them privately. The Department for Transport was going to test the waters by introducing 4 future transport zones in 2020. But because of the pandemic, they decided to expand this quite distinctly, really, and allow any local authorities to implement trials of e-scooters in their areas. And if you look at the right-hand side of the slide here, you just see how many different cities, both small and large, really have implemented e-scooter trials in 2020 in the UK. So just one last reflection from me on this. It's just that the pace of change in the market has been quite remarkable, really. It's gone from seemingly nowhere to seemingly everywhere that we're having e-scooters on the roads and on the paths. So why do I care about this? Well, I find it quite stimulating when you see these sudden changes, and it kind of has sparked quite a large amount of academic and practitioner attention. And I decided to implement this side project to quench my curiosity. So the overall aim of the project was to examine the temporal demand patterns for e-scooters. So look at the patterning of demand across time and just see if there's anything interesting in there. And I wanted to ask some follow-up questions for that aim. The first one is, what are the daily and hourly patterns? So looking at them, trying to detect any interesting components, such as seasonality, for instance, if that is easily visible. And then to ask a slightly more advanced question about how the demand patterns for e-scooters are linked to weather conditions, which are apparent when they are occurring. And then also to link that to a slightly follow-up question and to figure out if there's any impact or visible impact of climate as well, and if we can detect a climate signal coming through. So quite reasonably straightforward, and perhaps some might say bread and butter academic research around economic and geographical examination of this interesting new area of study. What's the underlying theory which helps to kind of structure the analysis? Well, again, it's quite simplistic, really, and it's the theory of environmental determinism. So this theory, at its heart, really just simply states that human action, so the action of humans, is usually implicitly or quite explicitly moderated by the environment in which that human is inhabiting. For some modes of transport, those kind of environmental issues aren't hugely apparent because they offer shelter. So for buses, for instance, for cars, for trains, once you're on board and in the carriage, you don't really care about those wider environmental conditions, such as the occurrence of weather, because they don't directly impact you ever so much. E-scooters are slightly different. E-scooters are like if you're walking or if you're on a bike. Really, you're often implicitly aware of the weather conditions which are occurring right there and then, because these vehicles offer no shelter. So the expectation is that we would see quite a strong link between the utilization patterns, the demand patterns for these e-scooter vehicles, and the weather conditions which are occurring. That's what we're expecting to see. So let's have a think about the case studies. So these are the 3 cities that we have examined in this preliminary research. They're Austin, they're Minneapolis, and they're Louisville, so all cities in the US. Austin is the biggest city. Minneapolis and Louisville are more medium-sized cities, but still big cities, medium-sized for US. In terms of the climate, you have Minneapolis being the most northern city. It has a climate called a humid continental mild summer. Louisville is present in the middle of the continental US, and Austin is in Texas, and it has a subtropical humid climate. For all three cities, we have trial data throughout 2019, but for Minneapolis, it's slightly shorter. We only have the trial data from May through to the end of the year, whereas for Austin and Louisville, we have trial data all the way through 2019. For ridership, Austin's the biggest scheme by far. 5.5 million rides have been observed on that trial, whereas Minneapolis and Louisville are much smaller in terms of their ridership. The only other thing to kind of mention on this table is on the far right-hand side. So Austin and Louisville, they had 24-hour operation of their trial. So e-scooters could be hired at any hour of the day. But Minneapolis, they had a curfew in effect. So you couldn't hire an e-scooter after 9 o'clock at night or before 5 o'clock in the morning. So something to kind of keep in mind, especially when we're looking at hourly demand patterns, because for Minneapolis, they're slightly constrained because of the curfew. So where do we get the data from? Well, interestingly enough, and very beneficial for people like me, is that one of the stipulations that the municipalities gave to the vendors, which said if you want to put on trials in our city of e-scooters, you have to make your trip data publicly available. So for each trip that's occurring on these three case study trials, we have data for it. It records quite a large amount of characteristics about the trip, but the ones that we were interested in is it knows, with a little bit of masking, when the trip started and when the trip ended. So we have temporal timestamps for each trip. So for instance, all 5.5 million trips in Austin, we know exactly, not exactly, like I said, there's a bit of masking, we know reasonably when they started and reasonably when they concluded. And so what I did is I took all of this data, hoovered it all up. I did some initial cleaning. So I stripped out, for instance, any erroneous or obviously wrong observations, kicked them out of the data set, and then I did some aggregation. So we have daily ridership patterns, so how many rides are happening per day on each of the schemes, and hourly ridership patterns as well. So how many rides are happening every single hour of the trial period. And we link that with weather data too. So for each of the three cities, I'll repeat again, that's Austin, Minneapolis, and Louisville, there's an international airport which is just outside the city limits in each instance, and not too far away from where the geofence of the trial is actually implemented, not too many miles away. And these weather stations at airports usually give quite reliable observations of weather conditions. And we have the obvious ones there that we've taken are temperature, humidity, precipitation, so rainfall, wind speed as well. But we also have weather types as well, dummy coded. So we have fog, mist, the occurrence of snow as well. And so we put all of these together into an integrated data set, whereby we have the observations of the daily and hourly ridership levels, so e-scooter demand, linked to the concurrent weather conditions which are happening on that day or in that hour across all three of the trials. Let's talk a little bit about data preparation. So some people in the room might know that if you have temporal time series data like this and you want to do multivariate statistical modeling, there are a few things that can kind of trip you up and perhaps bias your analysis. The first thing is something called serial dependence. And this is where you have an observation in any one given time period, and it is linked usually to past, but sometimes also to future observations. Sometimes it's also called temporal autocorrelation. If you don't correct for that, it can have implications for the validity of your model. Similarly, you have something called non-stationarity. This is where universal statistics change throughout your time series. So perhaps the mean, perhaps the standard deviation, that's a central tendency, the level of dispersion of your data changes as you go throughout your time series too. And if you have any of these conditions, it can, like I say, trip you up. And there are a few different statistical techniques that you can implement to correct for this, or sometimes only partially correct, if I'm honest. The way I went about doing it was to introduce a combination of moving averages and residuals. So a moving average, quite a few of you have seen this, unfortunately, over the last year. It's that smooth line that you're observing on the daily COVID charts that tries to strip out all the noise and gives you that smoother trend line. So I've used a 5-period moving average here in terms of the trend line. And I also took the residual of that. And I'll try to showcase, I think, when we do the initial results slides, the efficacy of implementing this transformation and how it kind of corrects for a bit of seasonality through serial dependence and non-stationarity. In terms of data analysis techniques, so once we've got the data integrated, prepared it through the transformation, what did we do with it? Well, it's quite standard practice, really. First thing we did was a bit of exploratory analysis. So we just showcased, through data visualization, the trends and the patterns that we were observing. I eyeballed it and tried to figure out if there's any visible or interesting patterns that we can detect. And the next thing we did is we did slightly more advanced analysis. We applied something called an autoregressive distributed lag model, which is a variant of multivariate regression analysis, which allows you to try to say, okay, here's the dependent variable, in our case ridership patterns, here's a load of independent variable, in our case weather conditions, and what are the connections between these two different sets of variables. We offer 2 different flavors of model as well. So the first ones I'm going to showcase are daily demand models, where we're using daily ridership as the dependent variable. And the second ones are a set of hourly models, where hourly demand patterns are the dependent variable. So the second models are slightly more ambitious because hourly data is much more volatile and much more rich compared to daily data, which quite strips out quite a lot of the volatility. So let's go straight into the results. So these are the daily ridership patterns that we're observing throughout the time period of the trial for Austin, through Minneapolis, through Louisville. The top part of these graphs are the raw figures. Okay, so that's the cumulative number of rides which are occurring in any given day throughout the time period. If we look at Louisville, for instance, so that was for all of 2019, we see reasonably muted demand at the start of the year where winter is still in effect, growing throughout the spring, peaking in the summer, and then declining quite suddenly, really, as we go through to autumn in the latter parts of the year. So quite a traditional seasonality component there. Austin's a bit more muted, I think. There's not a huge amount in it. You could say that it picks up and gets a bit more volatile during the summer, and then it's slightly more restricted during the winter months, but there's not a huge amount in it. Minneapolis definitely growing throughout the beginning of the early summer, peaking in late summer, and then declining quite rapidly. If we look at the lower part of these graphs, though, you can see the effect of that transformation. So for Louisville, for instance, the lower part of the graph shows that moving average residual, which really does strip out all of that seasonality, so that we hope that those issues of non-stationarity and serial dependence have been accounted for. Let's have a look at the weekly charts. Not that much to report here, quite consistent patterns, perhaps a bit more muted during the first part of the week, so Monday through through Thursday, picking up a little bit on Friday, peaking in Saturday, declining in Sunday. But for Minneapolis and Louisville, they're following reasonably similar trends in terms of how many highs are occurring per day of the week. Always kind of usually peaking around Friday and Saturday, more muted demand patterns on Sunday. So not really that much of interest here in terms of the day of the week analysis. Hourly analysis shows some interesting things, though. I really want to focus here on Louisville and Austin, though. So in Louisville, you see the demand patterns really growing throughout the first few hours of the day, peaking in the middle of the afternoon, and then declining really sharply through the early and late evening periods. Minneapolis is a bit more tricky to examine because of the curfew, so we won't look at it. Austin, though, it has some parallels with Louisville. It does also show a growth throughout the start of the day and a peaking in the early afternoon, but a much more subtle decline as you go into the evening. really. So you're seeing quite a large amount of ridership still in the late evening, and even in the early hours of the morning. So from from midnight through to 4 or 3 p.m, you're still seeing people use the scheme there, whereas Louisville is very quiet of those hours of the day. So the last 2 or 3 slides, we're going to go through the models. I'm hesitant to put, tables like this up because there's a lot there, and, I don't want to force you to try to decipher them in the minute that is going to be on your screen. So the way in which you read this is you read it down in terms of the case study. So you've got Austin first, Minneapolis second, Louisville third. So these are the results for the models in the columns. And then the rows are the variables, those independent weather variables that we've inserted. A few things I'd like to bring to your attention. Firstly, the model fits reasonably consistent across all the 3 models. We've got about 50% of the variation being explained in all instances. Let's have a look at the impact of temperature. To begin with, we see a very significant concurrent impact in all 3 models, but the size, the magnitude of the coefficient for Minneapolis is much bigger than in Austin, which maybe indicates that riders in Minneapolis are a bit more responsive to weather as compared to Austin. So this is where the climate impact might be coming through. We're seeing differences in terms of different climate occurrences. Precipitation is what you'd expect, really. Look at heavy precipitation, for instance. We're seeing here the concurrent effect being very negative and very visibly negative throughout the 3 different areas. But we also have significant lag effects, which kind of means in a daily model, which you've got a lot of people delaying trips, really. If it's chucking it down one day, they'll say, okay, I'll delay my trip until the next day because I don't want to get wet. So you're seeing quite a lot of delayed riderships here. Same with mean wind speed. You're seeing that as wind speed goes up, ridership tends to go down. We've got a negative effect here. The negative effect again is much more prominent in Minneapolis compared to Austin, perhaps again showcasing that riders there are a bit more responsive to weather conditions. So hourly models here. So these models are slightly more ambitious because of the inherent variability that you're observing in hourly data. Again, we have Austin, Minneapolis, Louisville models in the columns, the rows of the variables. There's a few more variables we've included here as well. I won't go through all of them, like I say, because it would take too much time, but I'll bring a few to your attention. First, temperature, relative humidity. You're seeing kind of the same patterns come through with the daily models, though for Minneapolis and Louisville, it's much more responsive as compared to Austin, both for relative humidity and for temperature. An interesting one here is trace precipitation. So this is very minor levels of precipitation. It's spitting, basically, and we see a significant positive effect in the Austin model. My interpretation of this is that people are probably thinking, all right, it's spitting right now. I'm worried that it's going to start chucking it down, so I'll bring forward demand. It'll almost stimulate people to take trips then, because I think, oh, I'll do it now before I get soaking because I can see the rain clouds on the horizon.
Craig, sorry, 1 minute left.
1 minute, great. Last slide after this. Wind speed, again, you're seeing what you would expect as wind speed goes up, demand patterns go down. Interestingly, here we have the dummy variables for some of the weather conditions. So mist seems to be reducing demand in Minneapolis and Louisville. So if you have misty conditions, it's inhibiting demand. And the occurrence of holidays in Austin, if you have a holiday day, it seems to be boosting demand there. So last slide, hopefully I'm bang on time. A few general thoughts to begin with. I really like to encourage municipalities and vendors to make these types of data sets available, because it allows people like me to just play around with the data, to tinker, to create, and I think it really stimulates these types of activities, and you never know what you're going to get out of it. So allow me to keep on playing around with these models, please. Keep on making the data available. But what does it really kind of mean? And I thought I'd break this down into different user groups or stakeholders, if you will. Practitioners can kind of do this type of analysis because it gives them a much more intimate feel about the demand patterns on their scheme. It allows them to plan a bit more effectively, things such as when maintenance activities have to happen, if they want to increase or decrease the size of their fleet to respond to inherent seasonality in the locations which they're deploying in. For transport practitioners, it can also help them think, okay, if we know that demand on e-scooters is going to be higher because of these kinds of weather conditions that are happening, what type of other modes are going to be impacted by that. So which modes are going to be harvested for demand? Are people going to stop using the subway, stop walking, stop taking Uber, and get on the e-scooters instead? And then lastly, for academics, we just like running these types of models and playing around with this data, but these types of analysis can act as the platforms for slightly more advanced stuff. So at the moment, all I've done is kind of explained class variation in demand, but you can use these then to say, okay, let's start forecasting demand into the future to see if we can create forecasting models. But that's really it from my side. So thanks all very much for your attention. It is still preliminary, so any comments, suggestions you have, just shoot them my way. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Craig. So